Well, listeners, welcome back to the podcast. I know we just had an episode out before with the breaking news of crash of the American Airlines Flight 5342, service under PSA Airlines, the regional carrier for American out of Wichita to Ronald Reagan International Airport in the Washington D.C. area. We had that episode out really when that happened that night. So a few hours after it crashed around 9 p.m. Eastern time in Washington, D.C. And so we were putting together some speculations. I do think some of those obviously have turned out to be accurate. As you know, we do talk to a lot of aviation experts on our channel, and they feed information to us. And we've been seeing a lot in the news lately, which we'll try to unpackage some of that as we get into the accident investigation. As we know from previous episodes, as we listen to the podcast here, really at this point, putting the pieces together and then learning from what went wrong to try to avoid it in the future is kind of the best lasting legacy we could honor the people on the aircraft with, is to improve safety measures. So hopefully this stuff doesn't happen in the future. But we are going to try to make it a traditional episode to talk about some of the things that are happening in our industry, because there is a lot happening. As we know, every day there's a tremendous amount of activity around the globe in aviation. More closer to home here, it sounds like the bid for Spirit Airlines, now we talked before they entered into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. If we know from before, there was, under the Biden administration, a stop from the Department of Justice when it came to the merger that they wanted to do between JetBlue and Frontier and Spirit, and kind of all this back and forth on who's going to go with who. And that was stopped for competitive reasons. Now with a new administration in the White House, a new DOJ, it sounds like they're trying to revive some talks there. And Frontier Airlines is making a bid for the Spirit Airlines asset. It's hard to say where people fall on this. I kind of thought all along they may have been, kind of pushing this out to see what would happen in a transition administration. And now that there is a transition, maybe they would go back and give another go at trying to do the merger. I mean, if you look at mergers in the past, it has reduced things like competitiveness in the United States are really down to kind of four major airlines that encompass more than 80% of the route space in the United States. That's between United, American, Southwest, and Delta. And you have the ultra low-cost carriers like Spirit and Frontier. Some of the conversations since the DOJ had said that they weren't going to allow JetBlue to purchase the assets of Spirit was that, hey, you're killing the ultra low-cost carrier. So if you look at that one side to it, kind of the conversation along it was, no matter what happens with the DOJ and kind of, hey, you're creating this, level of non-competition and reducing affordable flying. The reality behind it right now is people are saying, well, now look, you have one of the ultra low-cost carriers going into bankruptcy, and can this be saved? And if you looked at an ultra low-cost carrier like Frontier and Spirit, and we've talked before, Spirit and Frontier have both been changing their business models a little bit, but you could see the other side of this kind of being, hey, is this a play to talk in the sense of, well, we could lose an ultra low cost carrier through bankruptcy. I don't know. It's there's a lot of conversation around competitiveness, but there is another bid out there right now. If you listen to Scott Kirby with United Airlines, he had speculated that Spirit Airlines probably wouldn't last another 12 months or so, and then their assets would be available for purchase from other airlines, etc. So maybe with this new bid from Frontier Airlines, there's a possibility they could grow their network. We've seen some of these mergers we've talked about before with Hawaiian and Alaska. That was approved under the Biden administration, DOJ, to move forward. In this case, I don't know. I'll be curious to see. I have a feeling that this administration would look more fondly about this merger between the two airlines. As you know, President Trump actually started an airline with his branding of Trump on the aircraft. This would have been back in the 1990s. It wasn't long-lived, but it did exist. And it is Richard Branson that says, if you want to be a millionaire in aviation, start off as a billionaire. So it's a hard industry. And so we'll see this consolidation that's been happening. It's just, if you look over the decades of the airline industry, not just in this country, but other countries, it's pretty standard to see this happen. I mean, how many airlines could we look to that existed or exist now just under a name? Kind of like AirTran's assets and everything were purchased out by Southwest Airlines, and that was really a play by Southwest Airlines to get into the Atlanta market at Atlanta Hartsfield. So it is interesting, kind of keeping an eye on that. And, along with the JetBlue, because they did make that bid on Frontier, their partnership with American Airlines in the northeast corner of the United States was dissolved. But it sounds like, at least from what we're hearing, United Airlines is looking at a potential partnership or more with JetBlue in that northeast kind of corridor of the United States. So kind of the happenings and movings of the airline industry will continue to monitor and see what happens. I don't know. It's been a while since I've been on some of the low-cost carriers. I've been sticking with more mainline just due to the fact that if there's an issue, it seems like it's easier to find yourself routing on a different aircraft. But, I am in the Chicago market, and so the reality is if you're not flying on United American, the ease of that, the amount of destinations out of our region here, it's just hard not to jump on one of those two airlines to head out, or Southwest. I mainly don't do Southwest here because I don't go down to the Midway Airport, just due to the logistics of my drive to the airport, nothing further than that. But beyond that, that was, that airline just as much. And they do have flights out of O'Hare now. We touched on that before. I think they've reduced some of that schedule now, but there is Southwest Airlines flights out of O'Hare. It's just a little less. I've actually looked at it before. It's a little less convenient. But I haven't pulled the trigger on it yet just because the schedules haven't worked for where I want to fly. And now that they don't have that kind of open seating policy anymore, I don't even know how I would get on Southwest. Probably traditionally like I would with American and United, get on and find my seat somewhere. So, like I said, we're going to keep an eye on the airlines, see what they have going on. And, it's, like I said, you could kind of go either way on it. And, at the end of the day, as long as travelers have options, the price of flying is, if you look at it historically over the decades, it hasn't dramatically shifted the price per ticket, but there's some gray area in that because they also make billions of dollars in things that used to be free, like checked luggage. And so everybody kind of twists statistics to skew to whatever their viewpoint might be. As you know, we touch on everything aviation on this podcast, and I did want to bring up, if you haven't looked, and maybe I'll grab a screenshot of it to put up on our social media. There's a PIA, so the airline, Pakistani International Airlines, they were barred, I guess, from the European Union Aviation Safety Group from flying into certain areas within Europe. And that recently that ban has been lifted on November 29th, 2024, and PIA put out a bunch of advertisements basically saying, hey, we're coming back to Europe. One of the advertisements has an aircraft, a PIA aircraft, it says, Paris, we're coming today, and it has the Paris flag in the background, and then the Eiffel Tower directly lined up with this aircraft that looks like it could crash right into it. It appears that from the ad, it's a Boeing 777, which is part of PIA's fleet. Obviously, this invoked some responses, negative responses, to 9/11 type of scenario. Pakistanis, one of their ministers has called it stupidity and opened an investigation into who created the ad. The airline has yet to pull it down, and it is creating a lot of content. I know from this podcast that, the advertising world, some people say there's no negative press. Any press is good press. So in this case, people are talking about it. I'll be honest, as someone in this industry, I hadn't actually heard PIA. I knew Pakistan, obviously the country had air carrier. I didn't know the acronym. I didn't know who it was. So when I was looking into this story for this podcast, I did learn more about the airline. Again, who knows, again, kind of what we're just talking about with the airline side of the world. You've got to go both ways on this, right? You could have people out there that say, oh, they knew exactly what they were doing, and others that say maybe they don't. But at the end of the day, everybody's talking about it. As a matter of fact, I'm talking about it right now. I'm talking about it to you, everybody listening. So maybe it is working. I don't know. Who knows? When we talk about something on this podcast, especially when it's an accident or incident, when there is a report that's finally filed, in this case, this was the accident that happened at the North Las Vegas airport. I do like to come back and just follow up on it because, again, we talk about lessons learned here. And this was another mid-air collision that happened back in 2022, like I said, at the North Las Vegas airport, killing 4 people. In their final report that was released, it was a 23-page report. I looked through it. The Piper PA-46 and the Cessna 172 collided, as we talked about, on parallel runways, 30 left and 30 right. Part of the Transportation Safety Board's determination of probable cause was that the Piper aircraft, the pilot's failure to ensure that the airplane was aligned to the correct runway, it resulted in the collision with the Cessna 172. And then a contributing factor to the accident was the controller's failure to provide timely and adequate traffic information to either aircraft, and his failure to recognize a developing conflict and to act in a timely manner, which, of course, this resonates, I think, with the accident we're going to talk about here in a little bit with American Airlines at DCA and a lot of the stuff that you've heard kind of preliminarily across the news networks. Resonating again with what we're hearing, the NTSB stated that they talked to the air traffic manager, and he said his staff really didn't have a work-personal life balance, that they were somewhat of an exhaustion phase, just kind of coming and going from work, and that this was a contributing factor as well. So kind of that same narrative that we've been hearing of understaffed air traffic control facilities around the country. There was some reports on it that the Piper, when it was coming in, radioed to the North Las Vegas tower that it was descending for landing on 30 left. 3 minutes later, after being cleared to land, the air traffic controller transmitted to the Piper 7 Charlie X-ray. I think I said runway 30 left, 7 Charlie X-ray, runway 30 left. The Piper responded, yeah, affirmative, 30 left, that's what I heard, 97 Charlie X-ray. Obviously, this was an error on landing that crashed into the 172. I myself have, when I've been flying recently, I actually just got instructions. The airport I was going back into, I was to the, what would have been kind of the east, or I'd say the right side of this airport. So as you know, when you come in, if this was an uncontrolled airport, kind of 45 degree into what would have been, on this case, a left downwind, so paralleling the runway I was going to land on, runway 16, with a left base to runway 16. And the controller gave me instructions for a right downwind, which if you're coming in from the east side, let's say in this case of an airport, and you're getting a right downwind for that runway, in this case I would have had to overfly the runway and overfly the airport, but I just clarified the instructions, and it was to be a left downwind. But it goes back to kind of adding in those layers of safety when you're flying. Like I said, I only fly with ForeFlight now on ADSB running in the aircraft. We'll get back into the accident with we'll talk about with American, where the ADSB wasn't operating on the Black Hawk, but in this case, the situation awareness is so great. And unfortunately, this accident probably could have been something that would have alerted to the pilot, like, hey, something's happening, there's somebody in my direction of flight. In this case, being on runway 30 right at the North Las Vegas airport. Looking at their chart supplement for the North Las Vegas airport, it does appear that they're within the Mode C veil for the Class Bravo airspace at the Harry Reid International Airport. Again, if you go back to one of my podcasts, you'll remember I applied for a job there and was laughed out of the room when everybody said, it will never be called Harry Reid, it will always be called McCarran. Well, Harry Reid International Airport is Class Bravo airspace, which, as we talked about, not that it actually really resembles this here, but generally speaking, it looks like an upside-down wedding cake with the inner core being right over the airport, most protected, and then the layers kind of going out from there. And in this case, it looks like from 6,000 to 10,000 feet. And then there's different shelves built into here, 5,000 feet to 10,000 feet. But in this case, Mode C Vale, if they would have had, some ADS-B pumping, which maybe they did, maybe they weren't paying attention to it. I didn't see that in the report. But if they had, I love it. I can't speak enough about ForeFlight. It's great. It allows someone like me to have that situational awareness when I'm flying. I love it for the weather. I love it for the traffic. Like I said, in flying around the congested airspace of Chicago, I know exactly where I'm at when I'm going under different airspace shelves, whether that be Midway or O'Hare or even other airports. There's a lot of airports around. I think in Illinois alone, we're over 100 plus airports that exist. So it's just a nice feature to have in the aircraft. And again, something for when we try to learn from each one of these lessons, something to take forward. So if you're flying, I highly recommend it. I was a paper person my entire life, but as soon as I saw that technology, I'm fully on board with it. If you have been paying attention to the news at all, you've seen a lot of the reports that have come out, different angles, adjustments, people saying different things, a lot of false reporting that happens, a lot of aviation experts come out of the woodwork. A lot of good content, but for us in the industry, you also sit there kind of scratching your head with some of the stuff that have been said, especially from some legislators, because as we know, um, it is interesting, but we're not going to get into kind of a play by play on each one. We'll talk kind of holistically about what's being said out there, and at least talk from some perspective from people in the industry. But yeah, if you go back to our last episode on January 29th, American Airlines Flight 5342, which was being serviced by their regional carrier PSA. This was aircraft November 790 Papa Sierra. That aircraft was a CRJ Canada regional jet, Canadian regional jet 700. Crashed into the Potomac River when it struck. So before we get too far into this with everything that's happening, there's a bunch of stuff. If there's more time at the end of this episode, maybe we'll get into a little bit of that. But I do know some people probably tuned in just to hear the updates on American Airlines Flight 5342, which if you listen to our past podcast on January 29th around 9 p.m., that aircraft crashed into the Potomac River while on approach to runway 33 at Ronald Reagan International Airport. It struck a Black Hawk helicopter, which then it proceeded to both aircraft crash into the Potomac River. American Airlines Flight 5342 with the tail number November 709 Papa Sierra was a Canadian Regional Jet 700 or CRJ 700 with 60 passengers on board and 4 crew members. We have more information now on some of the passengers and the crew members, which we'll talk about. This aircraft left the Dwight D. Eisenhower Airport in Wichita, Kansas, for roughly a 2-hour and 30-minute flight into Ronald Reagan International Airport. From what we've heard, at least now that more reports are coming out, is that the aircraft, so the main runway at Ronald Reagan is runway 1. That's their workhorse. As we talked about in the last episode, that's the busiest runway in the United States. So it was coming in for a landing on runway 1, and it was redirected by air traffic control to runway 33. They did ask American Airlines Flight 5342 if it could take it. Runway 33 is shorter, just over 5,000 feet. We put a picture on our Instagram account for this podcast of the airfield diagram at Ronald Reagan Airport. It has the exact dimensions on it for runway 33. But this decision did put it in the direct path of the helicopter flight route, which has been referred to as helicopter route 4, which reports have just come out that the FAA has indefinitely shut down this route and Route 1, which are considered inside the bridges, so in the Potomac on, close in to Ronald Reagan National Airspace. I think this is, at least for now, as they try to determine the factors that go into these routes. But they were flying on Route 4, which was going south down the Potomac, and the CRJ 700 was now lining up for runway 33, which unfortunately put them kind of in direct paths of each other. We reported initially, we heard on the air traffic control that they did give, it seems like, proper instruction to both aircraft and the helicopter to maintain visual separation from the CRJ 700, which is on a standard approach into runway 33. Listen, standard, I'm beyond being switched off from runway 1, but that's a standard too that, that happens all the time where air traffic controller would ask someone to switch. It just happened to me the other night when I was flying. I was asked to switch on a runway. So the standard procedure, switch to 3-3, and unfortunately put these two aircraft onto a collision course with one another. When you listen to the air traffic control tapes, you don't hear the military report back to the air traffic controller on the maintained visual separation. This is about the exact same time the impact happened. But what I did hear on, which I haven't been able to really confirm, I don't know of this because I've personally have heard military traffic on VHF channels, which is what the air traffic control towers use. I did hear somebody on one of the news broadcasts saying that the military was reporting on UHF channels, so different frequency channel to the air traffic control tower, so maybe they did make a response. But I will say the impact, when you listen to the air traffic control audio, even if there was a response, that kind of alert was right at the same time that the incident was happening. And there's been clearer video that's come out now, probably from the airport's security cameras, which show probably what looks like the left wing of the CRJ 700 coming basically off of the aircraft because it has a spiral into the Potomac River from that fireball from the incident. And so it gives kind of a clearer depiction of exactly the impact of this Black Hawk into the CRJ 700. And from what we understand with the Black Hawk, they were doing, it was more senior officials, they had a lot of experience in operating the Black Hawk aircraft, at least as reported. And it sounded like they were on kind of a routine training mission, which potentially, this aircraft, we had talked about 300 feet, we've been hearing 300 to 400 feet where the CRJ 700 was, but that the helicopter was supposed to be at 200 feet, at least in initial kind of reports. We're hearing that it could have been around the same 300 to 400 feet, so maybe 100 to 200 feet higher than it was supposed to be. On a training mission, we've also heard that they could have had on night vision goggles, so we've heard that component as well, and could that have blocked some of the visual of the three people that were on the Black Hawk helicopter? Still remains to be seen as the investigation continues, but they have been able to recover the flight data recorders, the black boxes, for these aircraft, so that should give them more clues. And it sounds like Sean Duffy, who is just 2 days into the job and is now the new DOT secretary, is working with Pete Hegseth with the Department of Defense as they're in their new roles to kind of look at this developing accident and working in unison with one another to give each other the proper information. Now, we have seen some information on the air traffic controller side to this at the Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, DCA. It was stated that at this hour, the controllers had, typically there's a controller, I guess, from what they've said on a leaked report. Usually there's one controller working the aircraft that are helicopters up and down that corridor, so that 4 corridor that we talked about. And then usually there's another controller working traffic. At this point, they were combined, which is not unheard of. When I worked at San Jose International Airport, which is a larger commercial service airport. Many times at night, you'd have a controller working basically everything: ground, tower, local control. So they'd be working from clearance delivery to the ground control to the tower. Typically, even on that, if there's two on, somebody needs to be on break or to give breaks. So that's not unheard of, that there are controllers that combine positions. And one could even argue, too, that if a controller is working both these same kind of corridors, that he doesn't need to necessarily coordinate with anybody. He's working it himself, or they are working it themselves. But in this case, they were combined, so they came out in a leaked report. There has been staffing shortages, as we've heard. And so it's interesting, there was an article that just came out right the day before this. So San Carlos Airport, which is in California, south of the San Francisco airport. So a smaller airport, but on the approach to San Francisco, north of San Jose. And then you have Oakland Airport off to the east, or as we've heard, the San Francisco Oakland Bay Airport, which they got sued. I don't know if they're still going with that name or not. But the San Carlos Airport, they were going from FAA controllers to contract staffing. And so there is contract towers. When I worked in Laredo, Texas, that was a contract airport. And by all intended purposes, operates very similar to an FAA staff tower, but they're not staffed with federal employees. They're contract employees through different companies. And I think there's 3 companies that kind of handle regional areas around the United States. I think in this case it was Robinson was the name of the company, and they've been in dispute. They wanted to pay the same amount that the controllers are making now as federal employees, but they didn't want to pay the 18% locality, which is basically, San Francisco is expensive. It's the Bay Area, right? So they were actually going to lose their air traffic control tower. And the airport manager there had put out a press release right the day of this accident, so before this accident happened, and it sounds like they've been able to rectify that and keep that tower operating. It's a small class Delta airspace, so in the airspace world, you have Delta over your smaller airports, Charlie over a little bit larger. If you have instrument approaches in that are protected, usually you'll see like a class Charlie around like a San Jose, Indianapolis, those type of airports, and then class Bravo over your biggest airports, which would be like your O'Hare's, your Ronald Reagan's, those types. But in this case, if you think about it, right, you're under the shelf. So we talked about that upside down cake. So like San Carlos would be under the shelf for the San Francisco arrivals, and the reality behind it is, I would always take an airport with a control tower over a non-controlled airport. Doesn't mean they're unsafe. I fly into a lot of non-towered airports. But it's funny because being a pilot myself and listening to people, you kind of have it both ways. Some people are nervous when they go into a controlled airport most of their pilot training or most of their existence as a pilot is outside of controlled airspace, and so they feel more comfortable at a non-towered airport. I kind of have the opposite effect because I do like having controllers there to have another eyes out. An uncontrolled airport, by the FAA regulations, you don't even have to communicate over the radio, which is unadvisable, but it does happen. I've witnessed it many times where people will land at an uncontrolled airport without saying a word. So usually for me, I usually have my guard up into a non-controlled airport. But, again, it's just preferences. None of it's really unsafe. But when you look at the national airspace system, the amount of movements, and the congestion around DCA, there's a lot of speculation over controller fatigue, that this caused some sort of issue here where they overworked. We talked about the accident earlier, they understaffed. Reserved to kind of, okay, we're right in the midst of the beginning of this investigation. Should give everybody some time to take a breath and figure out exactly what's going on. It seems like the FAA has done the proper thing, at least for now, by removing those helicopter portals that run around Reagan Airport. So that's a good move while the investigation is underway and they kind of figure out what's going on. So talk a little bit here about the National Transportation Safety Boards. It's an interest of the National Transportation Safety Board as kind of this the lead investigator in accidents in the United States. They don't have regulatory authority, but usually when they make a recommendation, the Federal Aviation Administration takes it. And I think I mentioned this once before in a previous podcast, but if you're by the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., the National Transportation Safety Board actually meets right under there. So kind of I was down in like the food court area, not near the hotel there, and just kind of wandered up to the NTSB, which I was like, oh, I had no idea this was even here. So if you're by the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., you can always go down and check out the NTSB area. But, obviously with them being in D.C., they were right there for this incident and accident. And I saw in the news, I don't know if he's a lead on this or not, but their board, comprised of individuals, appointed on terms. J. Todd Ingham, I saw him on CNN. I've actually talked with him in the past before at a conference. He's from Kentucky, and kind of asked him, how'd you get into this? And because it's always intriguing to me, these people that are kind of elected to these board positions, and he has a long history of stuff that he's done in his life, and I guess he kind of involved in the aviation side to it. Now it's the National Transportation Safety Board, so knock on wood, right? These accidents that we're talking about, like right now, they're not very common. We talked yesterday about the Colgan Air accident, 2 days ago, and how that kind of transpired from 2009 till now. So it's been a long time since a major accident in the United States that involves a commercial airliner. Of course, there's general aviation general aviation aircraft that have issues often, but in this case, they're doing a lot of transportation safety work. So when you see one of those bus accidents, those type of things. But in his case, he went to Kentucky, and I think he was advocating, if I remember right from our conversation, for air service for a particular airport there, and he either got to know Elaine Chao or was part of at least a group that maybe he knew her beforehand. But Elaine Chao, who is the wife of Senator Mitch McConnell, basically that's where he got his kind of appointment from. So I saw him on CNN the other day, kind of giving his initial into this accident, and then after that is usually a 30-day process to at least get kind of a preliminary report. But we probably saw the press conference from the White House. Donald Trump kind of said it was a part of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's kind of back and forth on timelines. And I think Vice President J.D. Vance was up there, Department of Transportation Secretary and DOT Secretary. He said all pretty new to the job, kind of talking about hiring practices, and so that obviously stirred up a lot of conversation. Along was DEI a component of this, and you, depending on the network you watch, you could go down the road of yes it was or no it wasn't. I did see our Senator Duckworth, also said that maybe it had something to do with the fact that the Trump administration has basically sent out buyouts to federal employees, which did include, I believe, air traffic controllers, at least to the point of Senator Duckworth, which is like an 8-month buyout. That had recently happened as well. And so, but it was interesting when Senator Duckworth was actually talking. So she flew Black Hawk helicopters, so she has obviously some in-depth perspective there of operating that type of aircraft. And she mentioned about flying around the Chicago region here and under the Midway airspace, and kind of staying under aircraft, because we talked earlier about why the Black Hawk helicopter was at least reported higher than it should have been. So she was talking a little bit about that, but her kind of side to it was, the Trump administration has put forth that they want to reduce the federal workforce, which include air traffic controllers, and pushing people out. I said we talk about politics on this podcast. Try to kind of stay somewhat neutral on everything. I will say, as someone who works in the industry, there has been some changes in hiring practices with the FAA. I have some family members that were air traffic controllers, or still are air traffic controllers, and there was college programs in place to train air traffic controllers, like Middle Tennessee State University, Beaver Community College in Pennsylvania. They had these programs, ATC programs, which basically prepared people before they went to the Air Traffic Control Academy in Oklahoma City. That had changed. It was near probably around, I want to say 2015, 2016. It could have been earlier or after, before that. But there was a change to basically get rid of those programs and have off the street hiring. So to be an air traffic controller, the parameters were 3 years of working experience. So that could have been anywhere, doing anything, didn't have to be in aviation, and a high school diploma or GED equivalent. And so you would take a test, and then you would go through the rigorous standards that are required down at Oklahoma City. Air traffic control facilities are rated as a level 5 to a level 12. I don't know why 5 to 12, but 5 being kind of the less complex air traffic control facility. So maybe, something like a Laredo, Texas, something that's not as busy of an airport. And those are usually the airports that you see are contracted out. We talked about that earlier, which the Inspector General actually has put out a report that says those facilities are just as good, and sometimes, for the cost savings, better than a federally staffed control facility. Now, that's from the IG report. But from 5 to 12, so 5 being the usually where they pay less, so less complexity if they don't have radar, that type of things, and then to a level 12, which would be, like a Cleveland Center or Chicago Center. I believe Reagan Tower is a level 12, which usually means higher pay. And you can get into these facilities usually. So once you get in, you're in NACA, so you're in the National Air Transportation Controller Association. So depending on where you place in your testing in Oklahoma City usually determines the level of facility you will go to. But you see a lot of controllers that move up through the ranks, through the union, once they're in by petitioning to move to another location. So whether they're in, a smaller facility and they move up, but you can see some controllers that come in that go right to like a level 12 facility, as happened with some of my family members. And so they did change kind of how the procedure worked from, taking only college graduates and people from the military to saying, okay, anybody could really qualify to be an air traffic controller as long as you met 3 years of employment experience, a GED or high school diploma. With that being that you do have to go through rigorous training in Oklahoma City. If you don't pass that, you would have ended up without an air traffic control position. Now, with all of that being said, the kind of changes that we've seen recently with the buyout, I don't know a single air traffic controller that took a buyout that was so quick. I think, there's a lot of back and forth on this, so that information just has come out. But there is, and we've talked about on this podcast, a lot of changes in, at least proposed in the federal government, and people are trying to assess it and understand it. There is an air traffic controller shortage. They've been working to try to fill that gap. I haven't heard of anybody that has actually, like I said, left because of any of the new policies in air traffic control. At least nobody that I know. I'm not saying that I know every, I think it's a total of, I think they want 15,000 controllers in the U.S. and there's 12,000. I forget the exact numbers off the top of my head, but somewhere around that. But, I do know a lot of controllers, and kind of like with any industry, right, there's some really good ones. There's some people that, are probably, they're good at their job, but they're cranky. And as a pilot, we all know that. I don't necessarily like that, because I think that usually tends to steer people away from asking questions over frequency and stuff, because they feel like a controller doesn't want to discuss with them things as far as if they have a question, or if they're trying to go back and look at some of the instructions that they have been given. But with that being said, I would say the majority of air traffic controllers are, hardworking, good people that want people to succeed to get from point A to point B. When I was in San Jose, kind of a funny story. I remember one night I was working a late night shift, and that tower kind of, so Ronald Reagan Airport has, a noise restriction. So a lot of stuff closes down between 10 and 6 a.m. And so when you hear that, a place like that, then obviously the traffic gets a lot less. We're very similar in San Jose. So our tower would close, I think at the time it would close around midnight, if I remember correctly. And we had a Southwest Airlines coming in, and the air traffic control tower, the plane checked on and said, you are for runway 30 left, I believe. And the controller gave him clearance to land. And then in the middle of that, he gave out his whole speech about, Class Charlie airspace is now terminated. Class Echo airspace is in effect. Contact, NorCal, TRACON on whatever frequency. And so he's saying all that while this Southwest aircraft is landing on runway 30 left. And I can see him in the tower go from the cab, and I can see the elevator going down, and this plane lands. Now, the controller was within his rights because, yes, the control tower closes at midnight. You're no longer getting paid, time to go home. But you do have a 737 landing. So when the aircraft got off, obviously the pilots were in configuration. You could say they should have been listening to the frequency, but whatever. Whatever happened, they were landing. They didn't know, so they landed. 30 left, they have to cross 30 right to get to the terminal, so they get between, and they're trying to call the tower and say, hey, can we have permission to cross 30 right? Nothing, of course, right, because the controller went home. So I just got on the radio and said, yeah, you can cross, go to the terminal. But it's an example of, okay, there's some, when that guy was on the radio, everybody steered clear to the airfield because you knew that he was going to give you some crap for getting out there. And again, that's not really conducive for an environment. And I understand with controllers that, especially busy facilities, you want to get in and get out quick and you want to stay to point. But, like in that case, and there was a small example of many other examples of similar situations where controllers have gone way above and beyond. But, you are hearing some of that rhetoric out there. And Pete DeFazio, who used to be the chair of the Transportation Committee in the House, he's a representative from Oregon. I've actually met him several times. He has now retired, so he's no longer in Congress. But he kind of got out and said, talked a lot about how Senator Cruz wanted to add, on a flight from San Antonio and through FAA reauthorization, which we talked about in the last podcast, that there was this push to add more traffic to Ronald Reagan Airport. And he was kind of saying, hey, this isn't what you should be doing, and this is an example of that. Again, if you take kind of the rhetoric back, none of those flights have really started yet. I don't believe any of them have. I think it was an additional 6 routes. We talked about those specific routes in our last podcast. So that, again, is something that not necessarily, I'm not pointing on either side, but I will say to that comment, I don't think those aircraft, that set of it probably added to this incident or increased congestion. I think, he was saying, and rightfully so, the airport was saying, hey, we're busy enough, we don't need any more. And probably what you should say then is should there have been a reduction of flights? But, the Trump administration, Donald Trump himself, he said that he does not think Ronald Reagan Airport is at capacity. He feels like if you had the right controllers in the position there, that they could handle the aircraft load. Again, I'm just more kind of saying what we've been hearing across. And the National Transportation Safety Board has historically been nonpartisan in the United States. They just want to get to the bottom of things. And if you listen to some of the comments that were made right before, or I should say right at the first press briefing, they were kind of saying similar to what they've said in the past. They want to, understand it, get to the bottom of it, and make recommendations based off the facts. So as this continues to evolve, there'll be a lot of opinions. Been watching the news cycle because I try to make sure that this podcast is kind of up to date with everything that's being said across the spectrum, and that you guys have the most up to date information as I've seen, because I get a lot in from people that I know in the industry, and then a lot that you can consume that all of us can through the networks and the alphabet soups, etc. But so you can kind of take either pathway you want there, but at the end of the day, like I said, for us, focusing on what was the incident, what happened, and how can we improve, I think is best for all. And that's what we really try to do here with any of these accidents. So we start to know a little bit about who was on this aircraft, from the pilots to the pilots that were on the Black Hawk as well, to some of the folks in back. I saw Nancy Kerrigan. There was, I think, 14 people of the U.S. skating, at least not the team or support, 2 Russian nationals that were also part of figure skating competition. Nancy Kerrigan, I think, had given an emotional speech back in, I believe it was in Kansas, talking about the people that were lost on this aircraft. Obviously, loved ones touched everybody, and Kansas too. I watched some of the local news there. I try to get off the national and watch some of the local broadcasts, read some of the local articles, and obviously Wichita, a smaller community. Like I mentioned in the last podcast, I actually know some of the people that work at that airport. It is heartbreaking, and it's heartbreaking anytime it happens. But in that community, as they had a chaplain at the airport, kind of saying everybody will know someone who's touched by this in the Wichita community. And so, again, our thoughts go out to not only the Ronald Reagan Airport crew, over 300 rescue team members that have been working to get these, salvage what they can out of the aircraft, and all of that, all those thoughts of those people are with of course us, and hopefully, like I said, getting to the bottom of what happened here. Ronald Reagan Airport is back open in operation. It opened the next day around 11 a.m., which kind of an eerie thing, I would assume. I've never been in this position where I'm getting on an aircraft and watching an active removal. You could see, kind of the tail of the aircraft in the Potomac River. So if you've ever been to DCA, you're at the terminal there, and you have kind of like a perfect view over the airfield. There's not much obstructions because you're sitting right there on the river. So obviously everything that's happening in the river, you can just kind of see right out the window and consume it with your own eyes. So to get on a plane and leave out of there, I'm sure was an eerie feeling for passengers. But again, it is the safest mode of travel. And I'm flying to Tucson next week. So I will be out that way for a conference. And I have no second doubts about the dedicated people in their industry, the aircraft operators. Just again, an unfortunate set of circumstances that has happened here. But, I was saying the other day to someone, I was like, you talk about getting desensitized to certain things in life. And I think in this case, it's one of those times where we've actually been sensitized because, when I was younger, and I had spoke to this before, it was not uncommon, as if you grew up in certain generations, that a large-scale commercial accident 2 to 3 years was happening, and now it's been so long that it is, kind of probably somewhat of a, hey, never stop with safety, and safety is always first and foremost. But the fact that you have thousands of operations every day, and years go by without a fatal accident in commercial airline is a testament to the system, and kind of that the United States is still the envy for aircraft safety, and a lot of these layers that we built in. And of course, a lot of that comes from reviewing accidents that have happened in the past and putting things in place to try to avoid those moving forward. Well, we have had a lot of discussions today about a lot of things, a lot about the accident, obviously, because it's first and kind of foremost in our minds. I will say for this podcast, we are, I'm working with some consultants now. We may look at changing some things around how this flows. Again, feel free to drop me a line at dapodcast85gmail if there's thoughts, suggestions, comments, whatever you want to say. Feel free to send it along to me. But I appreciate everybody listening. We've been seeing quite a bit of listeners from outside of the United States, so thank you for everybody there that is tuning in and listening to the podcast. It's greatly appreciated. I am going to end it here, but I will probably be back soon with some further updates and some further content for you guys. But until next time, I will see you down the runway.